And that's getting at how we as humans perceive our world. We have a really biased view of how the world works because we're human beings. We interact with the world from a very human viewpoint.
Welcome to the New England Lecture Series. I'm Dr. Michael Tlusty. I'm the Director of Ocean Sustainability Science here at the New England Aquarium. And it actually brings me a lot of joy to introduce Brian Hellmuth to you. And today he's going to talk about the anthropocenic view of the world. It's the science, it's the outreach, he's the entire package. So it's a great privilege. Brian Hellmuth from Northeastern University.
So I'm trained as a marine biologist. I mean, I started like a lot of us wanting to scuba dive, and this is how I could do it and get paid to do it. And so I started off diving on coral reefs. So inadvertently, I became a climate scientist. I didn't start off becoming with the goal of being a climate scientist. It kind of fell on me because everything I was studying died. That's the depressing part of this. What you rapidly realize, though, as you're starting to study climate change, is you really can't study it independent of the human system. And more, rather than thinking of natural ecosystems and human ecosystems, we called these coupled human-natural ecosystems, where what happens in our society affects the natural ecosystem, and likewise what happens there feeds back into our well-being through ecosystem services, through natural resources. And so we have to look at this as this kind of coupled whole. Where this started taking me, though, and where I want to kind of walk you through tonight is this path that I never really expected, and that's getting at how we as humans perceive our world. And there are two reasons for doing that. The first is by understanding how we perceive the changing world around us, it helps scientists like myself to communicate those changes that we're seeing. It helps us to identify with the kind of things that are important to people, and helps us to frame what we're seeing in the field in a context that people can resonate with. But the other part of it, and what I want to come back to tonight, is how does it actually serve as an impediment to understanding what's happening to the world around us? And so one of the central messages I want to get across tonight is we have a really biased view of how the world works because we're human beings. We interact with the world from a very human viewpoint, which is completely different from the way that most organisms experience their world. So if we want to understand where the trouble spots are occurring, we want to understand where we can do the most good by trying to fix some of these sites, we have to view the world through the eyes of a non-human organism. So that's kind of what I want to walk you through tonight. So what I want to start off with is how we as humans view the world. And it turns out that we're really good at identifying patterns. So if you look at all these different images in the Mona Lisa, even though in many ways they're radically different from one another. You know, you have the kind of Andy Warhol view, you have the Minions view, my favorite's the Rarity Lisa. You know, there are aspects of this that we can tell indicate to us that all of these are representations of the Mona Lisa. It's something about the smile, it's something about the color scheme, it's something about the hands being folded. But our brains are able to rapidly accumulate this information, turn it into something useful, and then tell us, aha, this is Mona Lisa. And that's a good thing because, you know, if you think about evolutionarily, the last thing you want to be doing is if you hear the sound of a predator in the bushes, as well, is this the eastern subspecies of the lion from the northern hemisphere, or is it the subspecies from the southern? By that time, you're dead, right? So there should be pretty strong selection against scientists back in our evolutionary history. No, instead, once you hear that, you want to react. You want to have a gut-level reaction that says hide, run, get away from the source of death. And so evolutionarily, we are evolved to have very good pattern recognition and to do it pretty quickly. But what I want to talk about is how does that feed into our science? How does it feed into our understanding of how things are changing rapidly around us, where typically we look at patterns, those become embedded as part of who we are, as part of our experience, it's something we can rely on. But when things are changing so rapidly in the world around us, what does it really mean when we're trying to make sense of pattern that we see? So as a scientist, I mean, we will go out in the field and we'll notice patterns like this, where, you know, if we look up a mountainside, we see one species of tree replacing another one, replaced by another one. So we start to see these kind of zones on a mountainside. We can go back and we can draw that, we can put it into a textbook, And we can conceptualize it as kind of this heuristic diagram where we look at zonation in mountains. And we know that it's an oversimplification, but it gives us a way to start talking about this, to start generalizing, to start looking for drivers of those patterns. And so that fits with how we view science, so kind of this combination of deduction and induction, where we recognize a pattern, we come up with a hypothesis, we test it. If the hypothesis is supported or if it's not refuted, we'll then go back and refine it some more, and we'll do this in this iterative way until we kind of come to some understanding of what the underlying process is that drives the pattern we see. Where this gets to be difficult, though, is where we have the same objective information but come up with different subjective interpretations. So I have to ask, who sees a panda here when you look at it? All right, stare at it for a couple seconds. Lower your hand if the panda goes away. All right, thank you. So I did this at lunch, and a couple people could see it, a couple couldn't. This is not a GIF. I mean, this is a still image. So this is just an optical illusion where the lines allow your eyes to kind of see this in and out of focus. Most of you have probably seen this before, where either you're seeing a young woman where this is her nose, that's her ear, that's her chin, or this is an older woman where that is her nose, that's her mouth, that's her chin, and that's her eye. And again, the point is this is the same objective information. It's light bouncing off an image, it's going into our brains through our eyes, and our brains are interpreting it differently. Even, you can probably go back and forth between those two images on the right. And this comes to play in a couple different really important ways when we look at the changing world around us. So especially those of you guys sitting in the back, if you went out and went fishing and brought in this load of fish on one particular day, you'd say that's pretty good, right? I mean, those are pretty decent sized fish until you put it in context of what it was like in 1958, where this is at the same fishing pier where now all of a sudden we're looking at these whale cod that are absolutely enormous. So now that you have the context of what it used to be like, your idea of what's normal suddenly has a frame shift. I mean, typically we call this shifting baselines, where what we consider to be normal is largely based on our very recent experience, what we see in the last couple of years. And even without knowing it, our ideas of what's acceptable, what's a baseline, what's normal, change over time. So we can look at this by, we can look at a series of pictures in succession. So these are, again, all from the same place. And you could look at the gradual decrease in size as we're moving from 58 to 65 to 79 to 85 to 2007. And now all of a sudden it makes sense. Now all of a sudden you can see the change, but it's only having that context that allows you to see that, all right, things really aren't normal, at least not according to what normal was even 50 or 60 years ago. So what do? We try to collapse this into data. We try to take some sort of objective view of reality where we can take data points. We can measure the length of those fish. We can look at the length of the fish over time. We could put that on a graph like this, and we could say, well, is there a pattern there? And it'd be kind of hard to see a pattern, but well, what if I do this? Now all of a sudden, all I've done is I put these crosshairs in, and it helps guide your eyes to where, all right, we kind of see a cluster in the lower left and the upper right here. So maybe we can start imagining there is a relationship between whatever is on the x-axis and the y-axis, because I've kind of helped guide your eyes to see that. So maybe we can imagine that whatever is x is causing something in y. So of course the next step is then we use statistics. We ask, all right, well, let's try to get rid of all subjectivity at all. Let's just use this statistical analysis to ask, is there a relationship? And we use something called an R-squared that tells us the goodness of fit between the relationship. So in this case, whatever is on the y-axis has a 97% correlation with whatever's on the x-axis. There's a good fit between the two. So it says whenever this one changes, this predictably changes. Until I show you what those axes are. This is a great website. I really encourage you to look at it. It has these random data sets you can kind of plot against one another. So this is the fresh lemons imported to the USA from Mexico, plotted against the total US highway fatality rate. And I would challenge anybody here to come up with a really coherent explanation for why that might be. It's just a spurious correlation. It has a really good R-squared. It looks like it's a really tight relationship. But really, it's just a correlation. It has nothing to do with kind of cause and effect. So what I'm belaboring here is the point that understanding the underlying mechanism makes a huge difference. So for example, if I look at these two concepts of climate change, this is one that we see in the IPCC, where in the blue we see changes in CO2, and in the red we see changes in temperature. We understand the mechanisms of this very well. We understand why when CO2 increases in the atmosphere, it increases temperature. We even understand why in a couple cases temperature increases before CO2 does. It's because other things are driving temperature change on the globe. This one, not so much. I mean, this is a plot of the number of pirates versus global average surface temperature. And again, there's a pretty good relationship. But if we're going to have an international accord to try to fix climate change, probably we're better off going with the one where we understand the mechanism rather than subsidizing pirates as a way of fighting climate change. So understanding the mechanism really does make a difference. So in other words, it's complicated, and the details really do matter. So how does this come to play when we're talking about climate change, when we're testing our ideas in the field, when we're trying to communicate this to others, especially those who may have doubts about climate change, who for whatever reason don't want to believe it? How does this affect the way we view the world? So this is just, again, one of these kind of conceptualizations where one of the generic impacts of climate change is that as conditions get warmer at the equator, the southern end of species range boundaries should start retracting. They should start dying at the ends of the distribution close to the equator, and they should be moving closer to the poles. Likewise, on mountainsides, as conditions at the bottom of the mountain get warmer, species start dying off, and so you start seeing this shift, this elevational shift. And so this is current climate. This is under these different scenarios where the montane steppe is here, and now all of a sudden it's higher up because of this change in temperature at the bottom. And this is from one of the IPCC assessments. But now let's look at the actual data that go into those conceptualizations. So this is a graph that's from the EU, and it looks at the poleward distributional shift of spiders, beetles, butterflies, and grasshoppers. So all this really means is that anything above zero means that it's shifting north. It's moving away from the equator, it's moving closer to the pole. Anything below zero means that it's actually moving closer to the equator. And sure enough, if you look at the averages, if you look at those dark green lines, it shows that on average things are shifting towards the poles. That fits very well with that conceptual diagram that I just showed you. But look at the range of variability in those predictions. I mean, look at all those data points that are down below that zero line. So what is going on at those sites? Is that noise? Is this really just measurement error? Or is there really something else going on? And if there's something else going on, is that consistent with climate change, or is it inconsistent with climate change? So I want to give you one kind of cautionary tale of how this really kind of comes to play in the real world. And it's a paper by Crimmins in 2011, where they looked at the elevational shifts or the elevational distributions of 64 plant species over the last 75 years. So this shows the temperature trace where over time there are a lot more hot years. So generally it's getting a lot hotter as we move through time. This shows you over time what the elevational shift is. And what it suggests is exactly the opposite of that graph that I just showed you. Despite warming over 75 years, the plants are moving lower down on the slope. They're moving lower down on the mountainside. So they're doing exactly the opposite of that generic prediction. So not surprisingly, the blogosphere went nuts when this paper came out. I think even Rush Limbaugh jumped on board of this. There's a site by What's Up With That that says, another IPCC claim contradicted with new science. And it was really a big deal for a while that, here's this paper, it's in Science, it's one of the top journals in the world, and all of a sudden this is showing that the climate change is really not occurring, right? Well, no. What they ignored is that what also happened in this study is not only did temperatures increase, but precipitation increased. In other words, plants respond to both temperature and water. Basically, all this said is that, yes, temperatures were increasing, but that was overridden by an increase in precipitation. So yes, it was getting warmer, but it was more than compensated for by the increase in rain, which caused this downward shift. In other words, it's totally explainable by our understanding of the physics. It's totally explainable even in accordance with climate change. Yet the perception that was set up was that, well, if climate change is happening, we should see these upward elevational shifts. and instead we saw the opposite. So I spoke with the authors of this, and they said that they tried to explain this, and they did a good job in the paper. But the response was, well, you're just making excuses. I mean, this is a post hoc explanation. You told us all along that we should start seeing these elevational shifts, these latitudinal shifts, and you didn't see that, so you're making an excuse for why that is. So they'd already shot themselves in the foot before they even started, because this is what the perception was in the public. And to a certain extent, we in the scientific community are responsible for this. I mean, I'm sure you've heard why we shun the term global warming now and talk about climate change. Because global warming implies at least that every place in the globe is getting warmer, and it's consistently warmer, and next year is going to be warmer than this year. It's climate change, and we've even started calling it global weirding just because it's so much variability. But this is a way that it was phrased in the 2001 IPCC, where you look at a statement that of the 100 physical processes and 450 biophysical species that exhibited change, more than 90% are consistent with the well-known mechanisms of systems responses to climate. And again, in another part of this, either consistent with the process level understanding. Does that mean that the other 10% or other 30% are inconsistent? It's not hard to see how that could be extrapolated from this, that we're talking about what's consistent with our idea of climate change. This becomes very personal to me. I went to a meeting a couple of years ago, and when the IPCC issues its report every 4 years, there's something that the Heartland Institute puts out called the NIPCC, which is the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change. And apparently there are about 3 or 4 pages in that have showed that, I guess my work has shown that climate change isn't occurring, which was news to me. But what they latched onto is exactly what I'm talking about here, that there's variability, that the generalizations don't always work, and that by looking at the details of this, we get a much better understanding of what's happening. But this is the way of the world. This is the way the state of climate communication is right now, that the lines are drawn, it's either one way or it's another, and how we talk about it makes a really big difference because nobody wants to pay attention to nuance. So the kind of question I want to get at, and I'm going to come back to this when we talk about perceptions of climate change from non-humans, is really when we see things like that downward shift, are these really inconsistent with climate change? Is it evidence against climate change, just as when we see upward shifts it's evidence for climate change? Or is it just that we're not being sophisticated enough in our predictions based on our understanding of the biology, our understanding that plants respond to both temperature and water? But even more importantly, the scientific community has moved way past the question of whether anthropogenic climate change is happening. I mean, we're settled on that. I mean, despite what sometimes you hear, that's not an argument that's going on right now in the community. What we're doing in the scientific community is we're asking, well, what do we do about it? How do we prepare for climate change? How do we adapt to it? Not only how do we slow it down by trying to mitigate greenhouse gases, which is largely a policy issue, but then also how do we prepare for the changes that are coming down the pipeline? If we're going to do that effectively, if we're going to adapt, it has to be on a very local level. Just like all politics are on a local level, all climate change is on a very local level. So we can't act based on these very generic predictions that we see bandied about in the literature. It has to be very specific to the question that we are asking. And even more importantly, oftentimes the solution to climate change involves fixing something that has nothing to do with climate. We know that climate is one of many stressors. For example, it interacts with sediment runoff, it interacts with pollution, it interacts with overharvesting. So in many cases, we're not going to do anything about ocean acidification on a very local level. But what we might be able to do, for example, is prevent development or prevent overharvesting of a population that's already stressed. So the solution depends on the interaction between those climatic and non-climatic stressors. So understanding how those play out on a local level is really pretty key. So I just want to give you kind of 2 examples of that. The US is lagging behind the rest of the world, especially Europe and China in aquaculture, although there's certainly a lot of work being done here at the aquarium on that. But we're still trying to figure out where to site a lot of these aquaculture facilities. We know that species differ in their vulnerability to changes in temperature and ocean acidification and all these other variables. So if we want to put out an aquaculture facility, first of all, is it better to have oysters or better to have mussels? Is it better to have one on the inside of the Cape or on the outside of the Cape? These are all things, given our understanding of the biology of organisms, given our understanding of how climate is likely to change, we can make some pretty reasonable predictions about what the best place to locate these is at. Another one is marine spatial planning. In this case, we always have limited resources. I mean, the way we've tended to do things up to this point is we try to protect everything we possibly can, and we just recognize that there are failures, there are wins, and we take the wins where we can and we deal with the failures. But we're at the point now where there's so many problem spots, we have to be a lot more strategic in where we focus our efforts and money. So imagine a scenario where we've got 5 potential sites, and we want to put a marine protected area at one of those sites, and maybe we've got some extra funding left over for some sort of anti-pollution campaign in another one. How, just based on the biology, would we decide where to focus our efforts? But ideally, if you create a marine protected area someplace that is fine now, but it's dead, no matter what you do 20 years from now, you've thrown good money after bad. You've gone to all this effort, and if it's going down the tubes, there's nothing you could do about it. That's not going to do anybody any good. And frankly, we're at that point with a lot of coral reef sites. They are so far gone that there's really nothing we're going to be able to do with them. So just like triaging after, say, a train wreck, you have to identify those patients that no matter what you do, you're not going to be able to save them. If by focusing on those patients, you are neglecting other patients you could save, now all of a sudden you haven't done your job. Likewise, at the other end, there may be patients that are doing pretty well that with minimal intervention, you can keep them from dying, you can deal with them later. The most important ones are those that you triage first, those that really need immediate care and have the best chance of being saved if you act right away. It's the same thing here. I mean, the healthiest sites, you want to pick sites that are not only good now, but it'll be good in the future. There may be some sites that you have to write off that have low priority that no matter what you do, you're not going to be able to save those, and it's really not worth focusing your efforts. These are the ones, to me, that are the most interesting, those that are really kind of teetering on the edge. And even though there's nothing we can do about local temperature or local ocean acidification, if we prevent other stressors, if we prevent pollution or sediment runoff, we can keep those populations from crashing. And so it's these that I think we can triage by doing this spatially explicit modeling of where trouble spots are going to be. So really what this comes down to is we're trying to look forward, we're trying to look into the future, trying to make preparations for the changes we know are already coming down the pipeline, but we have to base it on what we've already seen. And we're trying to predict the future based on what we see now and what we've seen in the past. And so a big question is, not only how confident are we in those predictions, but how do we know what we don't know? How do we avoid some of those really big surprises that could really turn around and bite us if we don't know that they're likely to happen? And are we measuring the right things at the right scales? I mean, we're trying to make these predictions. How do we know what we should be measuring in the environment? Where this gets tricky, and what I want to spend the rest of tonight talking about is, okay, well, that's one thing if we're a human, but what if we look at something other than a human that has a totally different view of the world than we do, yet its performance and survival may have really big implications for us. So if we're talking about a commercially important species, if we're talking about an ecologically important species, that if something happens to that, we're really in trouble as well. How do we get rid of this human bias? And the human bias is pretty large, and we never realize it. So for example, we turn on the Weather Channel, we pay attention to air temperature, maybe the wind, and maybe the snow or the rain, but we ignore all other aspects of weather because it really doesn't impact us that much. And unbeknownst to us, it's really different from the vast majority of organisms on Earth. So just as one example, if you can imagine that you're gonna, we got Michael here. If you are in the bottom of the ocean and you need to breathe, if you look at it as a sea anemone does, you would have to reach in, rip out your lungs, hold them above your head, and just hope to God that the water's flowing. Because if it's not, you're going to suffocate. I mean, we take it for granted that we move air in and out of our lungs. We're able to breathe at whatever rate we want to, so we can ventilate ourselves actively. For the vast majority of these animals that are stuck on the bottom, they're entirely dependent on the movement of water over their surfaces for the way they breathe. They literally can suffocate if the water stops flowing. And all these other life processes depend on the shape of the organism as well. So in this case, the way they breathe, that they can control the breathing, is how streamlined they are. If they're really streamlined, they're not going to get ripped up, but then they're also going to have a really hard time breathing when the water slows down. Versus if they're up in the water column, if they've got kind of these frilly surfaces, they may get ripped up, but they're going to have a much better chance of getting oxygen. Another example, and oftentimes the way we look at this is we have to convert it to something we can understand. You've probably seen something like this before, where on the left, this is a flower as we see it, where it's kind of this monochromatic flower. It's pretty, it's all the same color. This is a false color image of how an insect sees it. So unlike us, insects and other pollinators are seeing runways, they're seeing bullseyes, they're seeing all this pattern that is completely invisible to us. That same information is coming into our eyes, it's coming into our brains. We just do not have the machinery to perceive it. So in this case, what has been done is scientists has measured the UV radiation. They've turned that into this kind of false color image so you can get an idea of approximately what the insect sees. But in this case, the animal is able to zero in the flower because it's able to perceive that information. And, we can parse this and we can really get mechanistic. We can look at, well, what wavelengths of light make it into our eyes that our brains perceive. It's no accident that we see in the range of wavelengths we call visible, because that's where most of the energy from the sun is. But if you look, for example, at a bee or a hummingbird, they're seeing in all these other wavelengths that are completely invisible to us. The information is there, but we just have no idea of how to interpret it. So this is what we do. This is what I do in my lab, is we do ecological forecasting. We try to take these very large-scale weather conditions. We'll take satellite data, weather station data, buoy data. We'll downscale it to very, very tiny levels, to the level of organisms. Ask, how does that affect their survival? How does it affect their reproduction? How does it affect their ability to interact with other organisms, to do all those things that we rely on ecosystems for? And then we come back and say, well, under these changes in these conditions, what are the what-if scenarios? What would we expect? Where are the trouble spots likely to be? Where do we start triaging in the future? And so we use a variety of methods to do this. We do it in the intertidal zone, largely because it's a representative location where we have lots of environmental stress. I mean, the intertidal zone, we often don't think about it this way, it's one of the most physically stressful environments on Earth. So these are marine animals that have evolved to live underwater, and then every day the tide rolls out and they're exposed to air for 8-10 hours a day, and the tide rolls back in. So the closest analogy I can give you is if you're sitting on a beach with a margarita in your bathing suit, and everything's fine, and you just close your eyes, and then all of a sudden you're in Antarctica, where you're going to spend the next 8 hours, and to make things even worse, you're underwater. That's essentially what these guys have to deal with. I mean, they breathe underwater, they're used to the cooler water conditions, water temperatures underwater, yet their body temperatures climb radically when they're out of water during low tide. They can't breathe, they have to deal with all these things, and the cycle repeats itself every day. On top of that, they're dealing with crashing waves, they're dealing with more acidic waters, they're dealing with predators, all these other nasty things that are really, really harsh. So the nice thing for us is that rather than having to make our graduate students and undergraduates schlep equipment up and down a mountainside, we can just make them schlep equipment up and down this short gradient, where the difference in stress between the low tide line and the high tide line is as great as what we'd see on one of these mountainsides, because the higher up you go from the water, the more stressful it is. So I want to use that model as a way of kind of communicating three main points that we look at with ecological forecasting. And some of these are going to be familiar, some of them probably not. The first one is that climate change is of course, global climate change, but it plays out at these ultra-fine scales. The second one is that species all have very different responses, so that there will be winners and losers. There are some species that do really well under climate change, a lot that don't. And this third one is the one that tends to be out of most people's experience, and that is, how do we view the world through the eyes of another non-human organism? So the first one is climate change is this worldwide phenomenon. And we've probably seen graphs like this before, where this shows the temperature anomaly over the surface of the globe. And it's really variable. I mean, there are places that are getting substantially colder over the surface of the globe. I mean, you see in blue. There are places that are staying the same. There are places that are getting a lot hotter. There are places in the Arctic that have gotten 9 degrees warmer in the last 50 years alone. The way we talk about this, though, is we collapse that down into the average of this is a 1 degree increase in the average surface temperature, ignoring all that variability. But that tends to get lost in the discussion. If anybody's seen that awful book by Michael Crichton that came out about 10 years ago called State of Fear, the first half was a work of fiction. The second half I thought was a work of fiction too, but he purported it to be this data-rich expose on scientists and how we're all colluding with one another. But his central argument was, well, if global warming is real, then every spot in the globe should be getting warmer. Think about it. That would mean that if Asheville, North Carolina is colder than Vancouver, British Columbia, therefore Canada is warmer than the United States. That's the same logic flow. No, there's a lot of variability out there. We know that. It's basically heat being moved around. It's not that every point in the globe is getting warmer. It's that the protective layer, the greenhouse effect, is trapping more heat globally. That heat gets moved around. So yes, we know that there are places that are getting colder, there are places staying the same, but the vast majority of sites on Earth are getting warmer, but the rate at which they're warming changes a lot from site to site. And the same thing happens when we look, for example, at changes in pH. There's a lot of variability over the surface of the globe. It gets moved around. Same thing happens in time, where this is a trace of temperature from 1970 to 2010. If you just zoomed in on any one of these little areas, you'd say, well, all right, it's getting warmer here, well, it's getting colder here, it's getting warmer here. Just like if it's warmer next year than it is this year, doesn't necessarily mean that climate change is real. It also doesn't mean that if it's colder next year than it is this year, that climate change isn't real. It's this overall trend that we see because there's variability from year to year. So when we talk about climate, we're talking about a 30-year trend in weather. It's that long-term trend, but there's a lot of variability around that. Now, this is meaningful. I mean, when we talk about a difference in climate of average surface temperature of 6 degrees, that's the difference between now and the last ice age. So when we say that we may have a 6-degree warmer Earth in the next 100 years, in terms of magnitude, that's the difference between now and the last ice age, only in the other direction. So that's huge. And to a climate scientist, that means a lot. It means that the whole stage under which weather operates is fundamentally different. The weather in the ice age is really different than it was today, just like the weather with a 6-degree increase in temperature would be really different than it is today as well. But as a biologist, that gets really tricky. Because if you are a tree frog sitting in the jungles of the Amazon, you could care less what the global average surface temperature is, especially how it's changed over 30 years if you've only been alive for a year. All you care about is whether your very local environment is too hot or too cold for you to survive and reproduce. Ultimately, that's really all that matters. If you have a very myopic view of the world, you could care less what's going on. Except, why you care about climate, it's climate that trains the weather. And so this is the way we kind of think about it, is climate trains the weather, but weather throws the punches. So weather makes up climate, climate is a trend, the weather. So this ultimately is what defines what weather does, but it's the left hook from weather that you really care about. And so to kind of put a local example on this, if you are climate, climate makes a difference to the performance of the team, but it's JBJ that you really fear when you're a pitcher up against them. So this is really what throws the punch, but climate really has a say in how that player is doing. And this really is evident when we look at some of these short-term anomalies. So again, we talk about a 3 to 6 degree increase in average surface temperature by the end of this century. We're seeing changes of that magnitude already in the Gulf of Maine. If you haven't heard, the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than 99% of other large bodies of water on Earth. And in 2012, we really saw that, where this is a temperature trace. The blue shows the climatology. So it's what's normal. It's what's normal for the period 1982 to 2011. The gray line shows what the temperatures were that year. So you can see even early on in the year, it was getting warmer until by the end of the summer, it was 3 degrees warmer than the climatology. So this isn't the end of the century. This is right now. This short-term seasonal change was 3 degrees warmer than the climatology. And all hell broke loose with the lobster fishery. So in North America, the US lobster fishery kicks in before the Canadian one does. So lobsters grew faster, they molted faster, the market was glutted. So by the time the Canadian fishers got to getting their pots in the water, the market was already filled with lobsters from the United States. And in fact, the price of lobster dropped because there were so many lobsters on the market. So there are these long-lasting consequences of this short-term temperature increase in the Gulf of Maine that happened and is happening more frequently because of climate, but it's a short-term increase in this. So that's the way organisms experience their environment, how it's changing constantly, but their vulnerability to that varies a lot. So one species may have a very different response to temperature than another one, or a pH. And again, this is something that farmers have known for a long time. I mean, we're not, at least not yet, we're not planting cotton in Michigan because we know that each of these crops has a different optimal temperature for growth, for reproduction. So we have some idea of what the physiology of these crops are. We can do this with livestock as well. And that helps us to understand what we should plant that year. If you look at the U.S. hardiness zones, the zone maps, it tells you again what plants you should put out. So all these different crops have these different optimal vegetative temperatures. And we can see this for a wide range of species. What tends to happen is species that have a very wide tolerance are species we don't like. So mosquitoes do really well under a wide range of conditions. Lionfish tend to do well. Those that don't fare so well are those that are already restricted to a very narrow area. So if they already have a very narrow range of tolerances, chances are any change in that is going to wipe them out. So endangered species, threatened species do not do very well under climate change because they have a narrow range. This is what partially made them endangered in the first place. In addition to pest species, though, we see this in commercial species we care about. So this is 3 species of hake. Again, here in New England, where we have silver hake, red hake, and spotted hake from the 1960s to 2008. And if you just kind of keep an eye on where the red blobs are moving, from 1968 to 2008, they're kind of shifting north, where they're all kind of moving north to where they're located. The red hake are sort of moving north, but they're also sort of moving east. The spotted hake don't move at all. They don't care at all about what was going on in the changing conditions. So these are all pretty closely related species, but they're all having very different responses to the same changing environment because of their physiology. So we pay a lot of attention to temperature, to body temperature, because it's really kind of the master control variable. And again, this is one of these things we don't think about because we regulate our own temperature. We have a fever of 103, 104 for long enough, we start getting brain damage. For a lot of organisms out there, their body temperatures are changing a lot, and it drives pretty much all of our physiological processes. So enzymes, for example, have a very narrow range of temperatures over which they work. They have to be, they can't be too rigid, they can't be too floppy, otherwise they don't work. If you ever made ceviche, if you pour lime juice onto fish, you are starting to make the proteins fly apart. It's the same thing as cooking them. It's making those proteins stop functioning because they're getting too floppy. They're sticking to one another, and so they don't function anymore. So when animals get too hot, if you have a fever of 104 for long enough, you're literally starting to cook your cells, cook your body. We can measure those kind of things using what's called a thermal performance curve, and every organism on Earth has something that looks like this, where there's a temperature below which it's too cold, there's a temperature above which it's too hot, and if it's below that or above that, it dies. There's a region where it does really well and all its physiology is doing really well and it's happy. But then there are these other regions where it's just barely able to hang on, where its proteins may be flying apart, where it's able to repair them, but it's so energetically costly that it has reproductive failure. So it may be able to survive, but just barely. It's not able to have any young, it's reproductively dead. The difference between this temperature of optimal temperature and death varies a lot from species to species. So for us, it's pretty narrow. I mean, if we go from our 98.6 to 104, if we spend enough time there, we'll die. There are animals that have a 10 or 15 degree difference in this. If you look at zooxanthellae corals, it's about a 2 degree difference. So a change in temperature of 2 degrees will put you from here to here. But these are all things that we can quantify in the lab, and we know pretty well the same way that we know this for those crop species that I showed you. This third one is the hardest one to kind of grasp because, again, we have to think of it in human terms. So just like that UV picture that I showed you, we have to convert it into something that we can understand. And that is that two organisms exposed to exactly the same environmental conditions, exactly the same weather conditions, at the cellular level end up experiencing really different environments. So look back at this. An important thing is this is body temperature. This is not air temperature. It's not the temperature around you. It's the temperature that your cells experience. For us, we know that as long as we're healthy, it's about 98.6 Fahrenheit. For organisms other than us, though, it changes a lot. And so 99% of organisms on Earth are ectothermic. They don't make their own metabolic heat. Their temperatures are driven by the surrounding environment. So if anybody's got a pet lizard, you know that you either have to put a heat lamp on them or you have to put a hot rock in order for them to heat up. So most organisms on Earth have temperatures that are changing rapidly with the environment. But it doesn't mean that their temperatures are the same as the surrounding air temperature. Just like if you look at your aquarium or terrarium where you've got a lizard in there, its body temperature is going to be driven by the heat that it's getting from that rock. It's not going to be the surrounding air. Also, the same thing is happening if you go outside on a really hot sunny day and you put your hand on a parking lot. It's really hot, maybe a lot hotter than the surrounding air, so hot that you can't even put your bare feet on it. It tells you that it's the sun that's heating the ground and the ground that's heating the air, not the other way around. So we pay attention to air temperature, but it's actually air temperature is this indirect measure of what's going on in most organisms. So a lot of these are familiar to us, some of them are not. You know, again, conduction is one of these things. If you step on out of a shower and step onto a cold tile floor, it only feels cold because the heat's being conducted away. If you step on a bath mat, it feels warm. If you actually measured the temperature of the bath mat would be the same as the tile floor. The difference is that the heat's literally getting sucked out of your foot through the tile floor. Convection is something that's familiar to us. This is what we quantify as wind chill. It's the combined effect of air temperature and wind that's removing heat from our bodies. Some of these are less familiar, like infrared radiation. So you know, we can think of these things like conduction and convection, but these are hard for us to kind of conceptualize. So it turns out that every object in the universe above absolute zero is emitting light. And it's not something we think about. If anybody's had an astronomy course, the temperature of a star tells you it determines what the light is given off. So if you are using a telescope and you look at what the wavelengths are being emitted from a star, it tells you what the surface temperature of that star is. So red stars at a different temperature than a blue star, so the wavelength of the light is related to the temperature. That applies to everything in the universe, including us. So we're emitting electromagnetic radiation the same way that a star does. It's just that the cooler objects emit them in much longer range of wavelengths. So we're emitting in the infrared spectrum. So just like the UV camera, if we look at an infrared picture, this shows a koala bear where you can see that its ears are a lot hotter than its eyes. This is where it's shedding heat. But look at these guys. These are snails in Australia where the difference between here and here is about 20 centimeters. If you look at the color key on the right, these guys are at about 40 degrees C. These guys are about 25 degrees C. The only difference is these happen to be facing the sun just a little bit more. So let's see if I can get this to work. So if we look around this room, let's see if I can get it to focus a little bit more. There we go. So you can see that more or less we're all at pretty much the same temperature, right? I mean, I did this one time in a classroom. This poor girl was sitting in the front and she was kind of swaying back and forth. She was a lot warmer than everybody else around her. It turns out she had a fever. But you know, we can look around and we can see that everybody's pretty much the same temperature. But if we look at the other objects, now all of a sudden we start seeing, well, sorry. We can start seeing variability in the other objects around us. So the seats we're on is a very different temperature than our bodies are. So for us, I mean, we kind of take it for granted that whatever life throws at us, within a certain range, we can make up for that. If we lose too much heat, we make up for that metabolically. If we aren't able to do that, we can actually start shivering. If we get too warm, we can increase the amount of heat we lose by evaporating sweat from our surfaces. There's a lot of heat that's released when water has a state change from liquid to vapor. So we're able to maintain these constant body temperatures, but for most organisms, they're not able to do that. So anything in the sun is going to have a temperature that's usually a lot warmer than air temperature, even 10 or 15 degrees. What's even more telling is that every organism out there has its own unique way of absorbing and releasing heat. So in this case, this is a predatory sea star. It's Pies-Esther. This is the one that's dying over the west coast from a virus. It's sitting there on its prey, the mussel. You look at the infrared picture, the predator's there at 12 degrees, the prey's there at 21 degrees. Neither are making any heat, but the difference in temperature is because this guy has a wet surface. Just like us sweating, it's able to lose heat through evaporation. It has a different shape, and so it's able to shed heat through convection differently. So when we look out at an intertidal zone, or actually any place that's in the sun, we see this whole range of temperatures of animals. And remember, it's the temperature of the animals, the temperature of the tissues that drives physiology, not the surrounding environments. So just looking at the environmental conditions, just looking, for example, at air temperature tells us very little about how stressed these animals are likely to be, because air temperature is going to be a lot colder than what the animals are experiencing. So this is essentially what my group does, is we do weather forecasts for non-human organisms, where we'll take satellite data, we'll take weather data, and we'll put them into models where we'll make predictions of what those temperatures are. We compare them against what we see in the lab under controlled conditions, then we make these predictions of death and destruction. And we do this in two ways. I mean, the first is we have these fancy computer models where really we just keep track of heat in and out. We look at all those different mechanisms of how much heat is conducted, how much is evaporated, et cetera. And we've gotten pretty good at this. I mean, if we know something about the animal, we can usually get to within about 2 degrees of maximum temperature, even though these temperatures are changing by 25 degrees or more over a couple hours. The other way we've done that is we make what are called biomimics, where if you think about it, if the color and the shape of an animal determine how much heat it absorbs, the same thing can be said for any kind of sensor you put out there. So if we just take an off-the-shelf commercial sensor that measures temperature, and we put it out in a mussel bed, and we measure the temperature of the animal right next to it, the average difference is about 14 degrees C. 14 degrees difference on average between what the animal is and what the logger is. Discover Magazine came out with an article about it at the same time Wall-E did, and so they dubbed them robo-mussels, and it's kind of stuck. Again, we can get pretty close to what the temperature of the animals are in the field. And we've done this for mussels, we've done it for sea stars, and for barnacles, limpets, you name it. And we put these things all over the world, where we now have them about 71 different sites, recording environmental conditions at the level of the animals, and that we can compare that to what our predictions would be just based on, for example, weather station data. And what we find are these completely bizarre patterns that we never would have been able to guess otherwise. So for example, if we look at the west coast of North America, where this is Puget Sound, as we're moving from Southern California to Washington, what you'd expect, kind of based on our perceptions of weather, is that it should be getting colder as you move towards Seattle, right? We don't see that. We see what we're calling a mosaic, where it gets hot, it gets cold, it gets hot, it gets cold, where there are places in Central Oregon that are as hot or hotter than Southern California. So what's going on? In this case, it's because of when low tides occur in the middle of the day in summer. In Oregon and parts of northern Washington, the low tides in summer are happening right in the middle of the day when conditions are hottest. In Southern California, the low tides are occurring in the middle of the night or early in the morning. So even though it's getting really hot on land in Los Angeles and Santa Barbara, the animals are all comfortably underwater when that happens. There are lots of other things that are happening as well that drive these mosaics, but we see this over and over again. We've seen this in different sites around the world. We see this with other environmental conditions. We see this with ocean acidification. We see this with precipitation and tree lines. So it suggests that rather than kind of this poleward range shift that we keep talking about, instead we're probably going to start to see holes punched in species distributions where they get too hot. Where if we look at one of these kind of hot spots, that's where we start to expect, or where we expect to see mortality events happening. And in fact, that's where we are seeing it. It's now been validated where people have looked, for example, at gene expression. They've shown that gene expression in animals from Oregon are more similar to those in Baja, Mexico. Those from British Columbia are more similar to those in Southern California. So these patterns that are invisible to us as humans, but once we get down to the level of the animal, now all of a sudden they become apparent. So why does this matter? I mean, why am I making you go through all this? The first is that the impacts are probably occurring in a lot of places that we're just missing right now. I mean, with so much focus on kind of species range edges, polar and equatorial range edges, there's a lot that's going on in the middle of those distributions that we're probably missing, or it's stuff that we're mischaracterizing as not being climate related. Again, just because climate is variable doesn't mean that climate change isn't real. I mean, we know that climate's variable. So all these impacts that we're seeing all along the species distribution are completely consistent with climate change. They just don't conform to that simple expectation or that simple model that we had. And so there's probably a lot that's going on that we're missing. The other thing is which species are most likely to be impacted. So for example, with the lobsters, we saw this big increase in lobster growth rate that happened due to an increase in temperature. What we're expecting is if we go just a little bit more beyond that, now all of a sudden we're going to be in the downslope part of that curve. So initially we may see an increase, but that's going to be followed by a pretty rapid decrease with any further temperature increases. And we see this over and over again in a lot of these species, where initially we may see this boom in some commercially important species, but just push it a little bit farther and you're going to have a crash. That's something we need to know. We need to know when we look at food security, we need to know when we look at economic security, what the likelihood of that is happening. We need to know that so we can try to inform farmers, aquaculture practitioners about how we can prepare for these changes. And then finally, I mean, it's how do we come up with early warning systems? Our ability to predict weather on these fine scales is fairly limited. We know what the climate will be in 10, 20 years, but what the weather will be is a lot more uncertain. But just as in that example you saw where it started to warm up early in the spring and then it continued to warm throughout the summer in 2012, we can have at least a couple month lead time for some of these impacts. And in this case then, the question becomes not one of science, but one of policy. So say we had paid attention to that. I mean, we know enough about lobsters to have a pretty good prediction of what was going to happen. But what do we do about that? It's not like lobster fishers are going to go out and suddenly switch to fishing for flounder or suddenly have another permitting scheme. We don't have enough flexibility in the way things are done to prepare for that. And those aren't easy solutions, but those are things that we can start thinking about. It's like a portfolio effect. How do we diversify our stocks? How do we diversify the crops we plant? How do we diversify the things that we hunt and we fish for in order to have some stability in the system to account for these year-to-year vagaries? So I'm going to stop there so they have a couple minutes for questions, but I do need to acknowledge my lab who does all the work and encourage anybody that has not been to the Marine Science Center at Northeastern to please come out and visit us. It's a really pretty place. Thanks. Sure. So the question was, what changes have we seen in Massachusetts Bay? For example, with the return of the cod, what improvements have we seen? So I think one of the biggest things is the movement of the sewage outfall at Deer Island that now runs offshore. And so that had a huge impact on cleanup independent of climate. In terms of cod, yes, I mean, there's some coming back, but it's nowhere near. I mean, there's some limited fishing right now, but it's nowhere near to what it was before. I mean, unfortunately, what we see is we see these movements of cod in and out so that there are little pockets that you can find, but overall, the stocks are not bouncing back yet. But that said, I think there is improvement. It's slow and steady. The final part is overall what we've seen in kind of Boston Harbor. Boston is being really progressive in preparing for climate change. I mean, there's a lot of discussion of, how do we make waterfronts more resilient. In some cases, I think there's been over-focus on how do we use gray infrastructure, how do we basically armor the whole thing. For example, there's one discussion of taking the Boston Harbor Islands and just putting a big bridge across them. I think we really need to think carefully about that before we enact that, because we don't know what it will do to the environment. In other cases, we still have a way to go. I mean, you probably heard the joke that the innovation district is called the inundation district right now, because they're building it in these areas that are pretty prone to flooding. So I think we're making mistakes, but if I compare us to a lot of other, especially US cities, I think we're way ahead of the game. We're not as far as some of the places like Amsterdam, but we're catching up fast. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll let Michael weigh in on this as well. So the question was, there have been some cases where aquaculture has been awful, and I think a lot of it is like shrimp farms in Southeast Asia. A lot of this is just effluent and disease that makes it out from the shrimp farms. It causes diseases in natural populations. It causes these algal blooms. My impression, you can correct me, is that it's been a lot more carefully controlled in the U.S. than it has been in places like that. And so, you want to speak to it? This is his area of expertise. What's that?
We also do oysters.
We also do oysters as well. My view of this is Michael's area of expertise. My view of this is that we've been a lot more careful in this country and have been proactive. I mean, there's this great case study in the West Coast in Oregon where they were finding that all of their larvae were dying and they couldn't figure out why. And it turns out that these upwelling events where there was acidic water coming in. And so what they did is they started monitoring it, and as soon as that acidic water came in, they shut off the lines that came in, and they wrote it out, and then they opened it back up when they when the pH event passed. And so I think here we've got a long way to go, but at least what I've seen has been pretty careful. And so the problems tend to be more overseas where there's just a lot less oversight. Is that fair? Yes. That's an awesome question. So the question was, as a student, what can you do to do this? I think there are three approaches. I mean, the first is kind of the grassroots movement to really start enacting change. And I think really what we have to have is systemic change. I mean, this really has to be a cultural shift where we pay attention to this. And frankly, a lot of that is voting for people that do that. That said, I think the other, especially right now, really important direction is finding allies, especially allies you might not have thought of as traditional allies. So there are a lot of businesses right now that are trying to do the right thing. I think finding partnerships with those businesses, supporting them, buying their products, and talking to them is a great way to do it. I mean, I know that climate change tends to be presented as kind of this Republican and Democrat thing, and it's getting worse and worse as we get more divided in this country. But there are a lot of Republican groups that are doing really good work. There's one called Republican that's looking at market-based solutions to climate change. Basically, how do we make corporations take responsibility for the carbon that they emit? And even if you don't agree with 100% of what they're doing, that's a great place to start because I think it's talking outside of the same sphere. And so I think reaching across political aisles, reaching between environmental movements and businesses is one of the major ways we've got to start fixing this. So the question was, is there any change in human behavior regarding responsibility for climate change? Yeah, there is, and that's what's gotten again, kind of lost in the discussions is that more and more people are understanding the reality of climate change and are willing to act on it now than in recent memory. Again, it gets lost in a lot of the loud voices that we hear, but even in recent months, there's been an uptick in that. As Michael mentioned, I got a chance to go to the UN General Assembly a couple weeks ago, and I was not at all expecting this, but I went there and they were looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, so these 17 goals, interrelated goals, and it was a recognition that we can't solve climate change without solving problems with education, with gender inequity, with poverty, with hunger. And representative after representative from country after country stood up and said, we are making progress towards this and we're decoupling the use of fossil fuels from our economy. So our economy is improving. We're not killing our economy by moving to alternative fuels, and we're addressing all these problems simultaneously. And it was just one after another that they stood up and did that. And I really found that encouraging, that there's a lot of progress that's going on right now. And I really hope that once the ball gets rolling, it'll really take off. And what was really cool is a lot of those were from developing countries. So there was a princess from Burkina Faso that has a solar energy company where she's hiring mostly women to make solar lamps and then distributing them to rural areas to help kids study, to help people get around at night. And it's making this huge impact on her whole society just by making these $5 lamps. And it's really encouraging. So yeah, I think we have to be optimistic because what's the other alternative? but there's obviously a lot of bad news with like the EPA lately, and our country seems to be turning away from climate policy, but I think there's a lot of success stories out there as well. Yeah, so I think to repeat the question, there are lots of things changing in the world right now, and not just climate. So how do we incorporate all those changes? Is that a fair way to rephrase it?
Right, so how do you sort of allocate blame, so to speak?
Yes, so how do we allocate blame? And so there's a big debate right now about attribution, that how much is climate change and how much is something else? And there are two camps to this. I mean, one is kind of the legal argument. I mean, I think you know that Maura Healey and Attorney General of California is suing fossil fuel industries the same way that they sued cigarette manufacturers for knowingly polluting without accepting the consequences. So that's the attribution. The other way to look at though, and to me at least, this is the productive way, is the way the military looks at it. The Department of Defense puts out it's called the Quadrennial Defense Report every 4 years, where they list the number one threats to security in the world: terrorism, climate change. And the way they view it is that climate change is a threat multiplier. It makes everything else that much worse. So it's not like we've never had storms before, and it's not like we've never had changes before, but the rate of change is faster than anything we've seen in recent history. Yes, climate's been changing, but what we've seen in the last 100 years usually takes about 10,000 years. And so to answer your question, when we address climate change, I think more about the solutions, and the solutions have to be integrated. You can't just solve climate change. It ends up being this social problem. I mean, you mentioned that in other countries there are problems with pollution. I mean, a lot of that is trying to fix poverty at the same time. It's how do you come up with social justice solutions? Because unless you simultaneously solve the social justice problems, unless you also have an economically stable solution and an ecologically stable solution, if one of those is out of balance, it's not going to stick. And so, to me at least, I'm less concerned with what percentage is climate and what percentage is overfishing, as much as, well, how, given our understanding, do we find a solution towards it?
Thank you.
Sure.
And thank you for
Oh, sorry, last question. Yeah. Yes. So the question was, what do we do when we encounter a skeptic? And I have a lot of experience. I spent 12 years in South Carolina, and it all comes down to somehow finding common values, because at some level, once you get past the hubris, there's got to be some common value to connect with that person and build back out. And so what we do know is if you start throwing facts, it's not going to matter. I mean, they don't want to hear facts. They'll come up with an excuse for why it's not real. It's starting from a place that they care about. So if it is working with somebody whose main concern is national defense, lots of evidence to talk about how environmental change is affecting national security. If it is somebody who is a person of faith, there's a lot to talk about with caring for creation and stewardship of the earth. There's a lot to talk about with social justice. There's a lot to talk about with the economy. So I think it's like anything else. It's talking to somebody, finding out where they're coming from, what their concerns are, and then figuring out where yours matches. And it might not always match, but if you drill deep enough, if you can get past the shouting, I think you'll always find something to connect on. So at least that's the way I try to do it. Thanks. Thanks.
Seals are the natural prey of white sharks, and white sharks are ambush predators, so it's coming out of the water in the process of actually catching the seal.